You can grab your seats. So welcome everyone to the Race and Gender Within the Animal Protection Movement panel. It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers. Speaking first will be Joyce Tischler, founder and general counsel of the Animal Legal Defense Fund. She'll be followed by Carolyn Walker, partner at Stoel, Rives, where she practices in the area of labor and employment, and with a particular expertise in gender and race-based issues. Please join me in welcoming them.
Good morning. Good morning. Hello.
That's good.
Better? Okay. Okay. Good morning to you all. Hang on, let me just throw that so that I can do my little slideshow. The thought behind this panel was to try to shake us up a bit and sensitize us to some of the issues that have surfaced within our own movement. We'd like to think that because we work for a social cause, we're not pulled into some of what our society imposes on us. We live in a society that is racist and sexist and ageist and homophobic, and I've always thought of myself as not being any of those, but the fact is I am. How can I avoid not being those things when it's all around me and it seeps into me? So what I want to bring up is how those issues can play out negatively and undermine our success as a social movement, because that is what we are. We are a social movement. So I will start with the issue of sexual inequality, and I want to begin by saying that I don't intend to point fingers at any one organization, although it may seem otherwise at some points, or any one individual. And also, I'm not going to make men into the bad guys, so you don't have to sink under the desks here. Because often it's us women, we women, who are equally implicated in maintaining the sexual inequality in the workplace. And in a moment, I'll give an example of that. But to start, it is estimated that women make up an actual 80% of the animal protection rights law movements. And yet, in general, women tend to fill the lower ranks in our movement. The leadership roles, the speaker slots at conferences, the positions of power and influence are disproportionately occupied by men. And in fact, there are some of us from the planning committee of this conference, and we're very conscious of that. And so you will see at this conference, we try to, and we didn't do so well here, but we try to have male-female ratios, or at least for the conference overall, we try to do that. So to be fair, the problem is not isolated to our movement. Studies of social movements have shown patterns in which divisions of labor, as well as leadership, are based on gender. There's also a pattern of women who start and build organizations only to see the leadership taken over by men as the organization grows larger, more financially stable, and more mainstream. And having just said that, I have to admit, I started an organization. I did choose my successor, and my successor is male, so I can't say, oops, it got away from me. In the past few years, I've had in-depth conversations with young women in our movement, and actually that was the genesis of this panel, was those conversations and the things that came out. And these women are smart, well-educated, they're professional, they're committed to the cause of animal rights, animal welfare, but a lot of them, many of them, are feeling as if they are faced with a glass ceiling. That even with the younger men in our movement now in leadership, there is a patriarchal old boys club at work. And as women, they often feel that they are left out of that. It might not be intentional, but it is clearly happening. I'm smiling at some of the people. Don't look at who I'm smiling at. In some of the more grassroots groups, women have complained that men tend to focus on the higher profile, more radical actions that are associated with masculinity, while women tend to do the more day-to-day tasks, answering phones, leafleting, direct care of the animals, the things that are less glamorous and actually considered less important. Or the men come up with ideas and then pass those great ideas off to the women to implement. And I've had that happen to me on occasion, and I don't like it. And I pass it right back. When I came into the movement in 1979, yep, there they were. The old lady in tennis shoes. These were animal protection pioneers. They worked tirelessly for the animals. I love these women. I admire their big hearts. But as a young lawyer, to be quite honest with you, I found them embarrassing, and I didn't want to be associated with them. And even more, I felt that we would never be taken seriously if we didn't move away from that image, and that ultimately the animals would pay the price. Sometimes we women have allowed men to take the spotlight. We've even encouraged them to do so because our society tells us that men bring credibility and legitimacy to wherever they go. They are listened to while women are not. And I've been guilty of thinking that at times. When women express emotions, it's viewed as feminine and weak. When men express emotions, it's a sign of fearlessness and masculinity. So on too many occasions, we have stepped back and let men be the public speakers, the book writers, and the CEOs. Men have been taught to be more comfortable assuming positions of power, as we've all read and heard about and seen. They talk louder and longer than women do in group settings. Sometimes I've found I have to talk over them in order to hear myself speak. They oftentimes feel more entitled to the higher positions and more money. And all of this is a part of our culture. We're indoctrinated from a very early age. This is not just 20 years ago. It is very much in evidence today. Too often, and when I showed this picture to Carolyn, she, not being a member of the movement, she was quite shocked. And as we were going through the PowerPoint, I said, "Now, is there any picture you're uncomfortable with?" And she said, "Yeah, that one." And I think, we're so used to watching this, seeing this sort of photo that for a lot of it's, oh, yeah, it's just PETA. But I don't think we should say, oh, yeah, it's just PETA. Too often, women in our movement are told they need to choose between the equality of women and animal rights, right? You're either one or the other. You got to be in there for the animals. We're all in this together, and you got to put aside your feelings as a woman. If a woman complains about unequal treatment or sexual harassment or confronts the person responsible for that, she's likely to be told, oh, don't be divisive, we're working for the animals. After all, women can speak up for themselves, but animals cannot. Who's heard that one? So the woman who is expressing righteous anger is expected to stuff that. And it leaves a lot of women in our movement feeling ripped off and devalued. Perhaps the worst news I've gotten in the past few years is the multiple women I've talked to who have been victims of sexual harassment. Seriously? Sexual harassment today in our movement? I can't believe it. And yet, yes, it is happening. And because of all this, the inequality, the stuffing of the feelings, the sexual harassment, we have lost and we continue to lose valuable and committed female activists. So the questions we should ask on behalf of the many women in our movement are, why are they treated unequally? Why are we looking the other way? And what are the repercussions of this ongoing problem? Now, I'm going to move to people of color. And by people of color, I mean African Americans, sometimes referred to as blacks, Latinos, Hispanics, Asians from a variety, or whose ancestors come from a variety of countries. And the question there is a different question. That question is, where are they We can all look around and make them uncomfortable. And why aren't they here with us? Okay, very funny. They're in Kenya, yes, right. There are three, I apologize for making you uncomfortable. There are three people, and only one, and two are African American, the other is African. And remind me to take a selfie with all of them because we want to prove that, they're here. It's good for the website, right? Let's use them while we can. But we have to ask those, I'm sorry, that was a horrible joke.
But it's one we hear.
Right, yeah. A lot of white animal activists feels frustrated by the whiteness of our movement. But when these questions come up, the responses we frequently hear are, well, they are too busy with their own causes, or they just don't care about animals. Those answers are racist. They're assuming that they are doing it and it has nothing to do with us. These kinds of answers arise because we see the world through the lens of our dominant white culture. I'd like to think, as I said earlier, that I'm not a racist. But how can I not be? It's all around me. It permeates everything I do and everyone I know. So I want to ask each of us to consider the possibility that could it be that persons of color, people of color, are not here because of something that we are doing or failing to do. Patrick Kwan founded the Student Animal Rights Alliance when he was still a teenager. And he later went on to work as a state director for HSUS. And he has said, at the first demonstration I went to, someone asked me, do you speak English? And that was in New York City. He has said that white staffers of animal protection agencies he has worked with or been corresponded with have said things like, I can't believe how Asians treat animals. And I don't like Asians. That comes out. They probably said, I don't like Asians, but you're okay. Today he works for the New York City Smoke-Free group. Their gain, our loss. With the exception of PETA and the Food Empowerment Project, most animal protection groups do not actively reach out to people of color and communities of color. We simply don't. If people of color show up, they tend to be exploited. One African American activist describes how it feels to experience such tokenism. He would get a call from white activists saying, hey, we need a black face at our protest. Will you come? And he said, I go, but this is not unifying. It's marginalizing. It's telling me you're not one of us, but we need you. We need you for the optics. A few years ago, I was teaching an animal law class at John F. Kennedy Law School in the Bay Area. And there were several people of color in my class, and as it happens, they were the leaders of the SALDIF group at that school. And that year, our conference was going to be held at Stanford Law School, which was local, and we could all get to it easily. And I wanted them to go to the conference because I wanted them to network, and I wanted them to, the conference is great. I love the conference, and I thought they'd learn a lot there. And they did, and as soon as I walked over to them, the first thing that one person said to me is, we're the only people of color here. It was very awkward, very uncomfortable for them and for me. And last year, Af Ko, who was unable to be with us on this panel, Af is a black, feminist, vegan activist and blogger who has advocated for animal rights since she was 18 years old. She published an online article, which I encourage you to read, and the title of it is 3 Reasons Black Folks Don't Join the Animal Rights Movement and Why We Should. So she's speaking to all of us. One complaint she has heard repeatedly from African Americans is that they see major celebrities publicly denouncing, say, for example, the killing of Cecil, the lion in Africa, but they're silent about Black Lives Matter or black men being shot by white cops. What's worse is that animal rights activists who are white frequently, and I know this is going to rile up some people, but frequently draw comparisons between the oppression of black slaves in the United States and the oppression of animals. By doing that, we are refusing to acknowledge or maybe care about how that message is heard by African Americans. Yes, the slavery of African Americans is no longer happening. We all know that. But can anyone seriously argue that the U.S. is not a deeply and viciously racist society right now today? A 2015 investigation of the San Francisco Police Department, San Francisco, the liberal progressive bubble that I live near, but this investigation revealed that a text message in which police officers referred to black people as monkeys. One text referring to black people read, "It's not against the law to put an animal down." Honestly, if you said that about my child, I'd want to kill you. The sensitivity of black people to comparisons with animals is quite legitimate. It is an open, bleeding wound, and the animal rights movement needs to stop feeding into this practice. Even if it's not intended, we're pulling down black people in order to pull up animals. Do people of color care about animals? A lot more than we realize. Surveys have shown that African Americans are actually more likely to consider vegetarianism than white people after being educated about the plight of farmed animals. Activists leafleting on behalf of PETA have said that the people who show the most interest in the suffering animals are African Americans, both male and female, Latinos, both male and female, and young white people. The least interest comes from old white men. No surprise there, who, according to these activists, never take our flyers. In not reaching out to people of color, in not helping them feel welcome, we're missing out on the involvement of a large segment of our society. And if we want to bring our issue into the mainstream, we need to examine both our own racism and we need to stop pointing the finger at them. In closing, I'd like to share with you a concept that I just adore. It's called Tikkun Olam, and I've talked about this before. Tikkun Olam comes from the religion that I was raised in, and it tells us that the world is broken and we need to mend the world. Our job is to mend the world. And this concept encourages us to stretch our hearts and embrace more of this world that we're in, to stand beside those who are wounded, those who are defenseless, and to embrace those who suffer, to acknowledge and to reach out to those who are ignored, disempowered, and abused. It's not just a religious concept or a feel-good agenda. It is central to the meaning of our lives. The world needs more generosity, more inclusiveness, and better care. And discovering how to mend the world is a profoundly important task. When I stand in solidarity with all life, animal and human, my experience of living changes. I'm no longer a private person concerned only with taking care of me and mine. Tikkun Olam means recognizing the well-being of those with whom I share this planet, all beings. And when I look into their eyes, I see my own. Whatever situation may come before me, I will try to do no harm, but more importantly, I will work to relieve the suffering and to offer love. This is the ethical basis of every social movement. It's not okay to work for the animals and at the same time abuse human beings. We need to catch ourselves when we use exploitive language of any kind. If we maintain a culture in the animal rights movement of animal rights versus women, animal rights versus people of color, we are undercutting the deeper meaning of our social movement. We're in a movement that is working at the roots to create a world in which we embrace and nurture diversity and in which we respect and recognize the interconnectedness of all life. So let's walk our talk. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Carolyn Walker, as Raj has already introduced, and I am a 25-plus year attorney at the law firm of Stoel, Rives in Portland, Oregon. And in parallel with my career as a management side, labor and employment and education law attorney, I've focused on issues of diversity and inclusion and retention in the workplace. So when I was asked to come here to speak at this panel, I jumped at the chance. Plus, we were able to snag tickets to Hamilton, which we're going to see at 3 o'clock today. The description of this panel discussion is charges of racism and sexism within the animal protection movement are causing some to question whether it is time for a broad-based internal reflection and hard questions. And I would say that the answer to that question is yes, absolutely, it's long past time. Now, I'm going to focus on these issues in the context of employment within the movement. And the issues that I understand that many of you have seen regarding employment matters in the animal rights protection movement is similar to what I've seen in the broader employment community in every industry and every profession, including professional women, as Joyce mentioned, experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace in this day and age, some 25 plus years after the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings brought this very serious issue into the limelight. There are unbelievably some who still think that they can do whatever they want to women because they're a star, and women will let you do it, right? Well, guess what, Mr. Trump? You can't. Thank you for that. I do apologize for my digression, and it probably won't be the only one this morning. Okay. Women are still hitting a glass ceiling in the animal rights movement, as Joyce mentioned, and it's just like that in the rest of the broader employment community. People of color are being marginalized and subjected to either overt racist behavior or microaggressions and microinequities that lead to death by 1,000 cuts. So I'm really excited to be here to engage in this discussion with you because by your presence here, I consider you my allies in these, with respect to these issues. But first, let's quickly discuss the applicable law regarding race and gender in the employment context and the potential consequences for violating the law. I understand that most of you here are lawyers, so you've probably heard many of these ideas before, but I'm just going to go over them very quickly for those of you who haven't. And then after we talk about the law, I'm going to talk about what we can do to change the paradigm, either as a person who has directly or indirectly experienced the negative effects of racism or sexism in the workplace, or both if we're talking intersectionality here, or as a perpetrator, albeit unintentional, of this kind of behavior. And finally, we will wrap up and talk about issues that go beyond the law. And I know that's a tall order within the next 25, 30 minutes I have to talk to you, but Joyce and I actually wanted to give you time for questions and comments before we wrap this up today. So when we talk about race and gender in the context of employment law, the focus is generally on issues of discrimination and harassment. And for any of you that have had training on these issues, you know that discrimination and harassment law has a number of key theories for protection. First, there's disparate treatment, which primarily addresses intentional acts with discriminatory animus. For example, this is a category into which sexual harassment would fall, or not giving a person of color the same opportunities for advancement that would be given to a white person. There's a disparate impact theory, which prohibits actions that, while they may lack a discriminatory animus, they have a discriminatory impact on a protected group without having a countervailing business justification. So for example, if within your organization or your firm or your company, you require everybody to have a bachelor's degree with some animal rights background training or experience, and you apply that across the board from your CEO or executive director down to your receptionist, you are going to lose a lot of people that could potentially come work for you. You're going to exclude a number of individuals, particular people of color, from, say, that receptionist job or other jobs when the degree is really not necessary for the receptionist or other person to do a good job. Obviously, that's not going to be the case for the CEO or your executive director, but think about those things, and I'll discuss more on these issues later. There's a strict liability theory for when discriminatory or harassing action that's taken by your managers or supervisors. And then there's also liability for severe or pervasive actions that have the purpose or the effect of creating a hostile work environment. And the last theory I want to raise is retaliation. Employees who complain about a bias often feel that they are treated worse for complaining and allege retaliation. And often the likelihood of success of a person who has alleged retaliation, a retaliation claim, is greater than the likelihood of success on the underlying bias claim. So let's talk about who is protected. Everyone who falls into one of these categories is protected. So that means everyone in the United States. That is all human animals, okay? The major law that we're talking about here is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and that's at the federal level, but then there are equivalent state laws that apply. And while the scope of this list of individuals is pretty well known and self-evident, I want to note for you the evolving sex discrimination theory under federal law. It has prohibited gender stereotyping since the 1980s, and it's further evolved in recent years to prohibit all discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in both public accommodations and employment. Now, we probably simply don't have time to get deep into these issues of intersectionality, race, gender, and gender identity, but I did want to call this to your attention because it is important and the issues are becoming less esoteric and more mainstream. So it's just something for you to keep in mind when we're talking about race and gender in the workplace. There's this issue of intersectionality that is becoming more prominent. So beyond that, what decisions matter? Well, in the employment context, the employment actions that matter in terms of considering issues of race and gender identity are all of those that are listed: hiring, firing, compensation, promotion, the terms and conditions and privileges of employment. And while I'm focusing on race and gender here, remember from our previous slide that there are many other protected classifications that we all need to be concerned about in the context of equity and the absence of harassment and discrimination in the workplace. Now I want to talk to you about the potential consequences of harassment and discrimination, and this is from the legal context. If companies or organizations or individuals engage in behavior towards employees that are found by a judge or a jury to be discriminatory or harassing, these are the potential consequences from a legal perspective. You've got back pay, front pay, emotional distress damages, and punitive damages to punish the company, the individual, or the organization for that bad behavior. There's attorney's fees. And in situations where the employee has been either involuntarily terminated or has been what they would say forced to resign, which would constitute a claim for constructive discharge, if they're able to prove that, then they could be entitled to reinstatement. So those are the legal consequences, but let's talk about how and where even arguably greater damage manifests. And by that, I'm talking about beyond the law. And what you're going to hear me do is reiterate and reinforce some of the things that Joyce talked to you about. The effects of illegal racism and sexism in the employment context can be terribly expensive in terms of economic consequences, but the consequences go way beyond that. And I think we kind of all know what I'm talking about here. There's also the cost of a damaged business reputation, the loss of the ability to recruit others, because people can go to Glassdoor now and see what other individuals are saying about the companies or the organizations that they worked for. And also loss of credibility within the movement for you guys. The employee who has suffered the discrimination and the harassment feels more marginalized, has a loss of productivity, feels demoralized, and really unmotivated to further participate in a movement such as yours that frankly needs all of the help that it can get, right? All of the support it can get. So within and beyond the legal context, we should also talk about implicit bias, which no doubt you've all heard of by now, right? Yeah. What is implicit bias? What I can tell you is that there is actually no legal definition for this emerging concept, but it's been characterized as unconscious attitudes that result in subjective actions that are non-neutral and have adverse effects. So these actions collectively might be legally actionable if based on an employee's protected status. It's real, and it's terribly damaging. And it can result in microaggressions or micro inequities directed towards members of an already marginalized group of people, specifically women and people of color. Micro inequities refers to ways individuals are either singled out or ignored or discounted, and it's based on a certain characteristic, and as Joyce mentioned, often it's based on gender, and often it's based on race. And it's those often little unconscious or seemingly innocuous gestures or actions that can be hard to prove, but they lead to some further sense of isolation or marginalization of these individuals. And I'll give you some examples that come to mind that may not be quite obvious to all of you, but to a person of color or a woman, we feel it intensely. So for example, if you're in a meeting with a mixed group of males, females, and there's a man that is leading the meeting, and the man asks one of the women in the group to take notes on the meeting, as opposed to asking one of the men, or to organize a going away party for a coworker, things that are traditionally women's work. These are the kinds of things that start to get to women. Or if there's a person of color, say an African American male, and when you meet him or you greet him, you give him a soul handshake, or you start to talk to him about a black TV show that you've seen, in a way that you would never approach someone who was not a person of color. People of color have problems with that kind of behavior. Another example is touching a black woman's hair without permission. I've had it happen to me. Sometimes even asking permission to do that. We're not objects of curiosity, or at least we don't like to be thought of as such. Inviting a person of color within your firm or your organization to serve on a diversity committee while failing to ask those people of color to serve on other important organizations or committees within your organization. So for me, and probably for the rest of you, that begs the question what you can do. So what can you do? Well, first, if you're privileged or empowered, as most of you are that are sitting in this room, based on your race, based on your gender, based on your gender identity, based on your physical abilities, then seek first to understand. That's the first step you can take. Only if we understand will we care. Only if we care will we help. Only if we help shall all be saved. And if you don't recognize that quote, it's a quote from Jane Goodall. And obviously it can be applied within the animal protection movement, but also within the context of human rights, environmental concerns, you name it. Now, what else can you do? If you're a person who has experienced behavior that marginalizes you, or you've witnessed others experiencing that kind of behavior, then seek to educate and speak out. This is critically important. Individuals and organizations within your movement have to challenge their assumptions and get uncomfortable. And I want you to think really hard about that when I say get uncomfortable, and it'll start to make sense to you as I move on. Otherwise, you're guaranteed not to have change within your movement and within your organizations. So I want to get more specific with you to give you some tips to take away with you. In areas of recruitment, where are you looking for your employees? Think hard about that. Are you going to HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities? Are you advertising in local newspapers that are geared towards people of color, like The Scanner or The Asian Reporter? Are you seeking to speak with student groups whose demographic is not adequately represented in jobs within the movement, like the Black Students Union or the Asian Student Associations on college campuses? And here's another important point to consider. Watch your assumptions. I'm going to give you a personal example of how I, as an African American woman, am routinely ignored by animal rights activists. When I'm walking downtown, I often see activists that are approaching people and trying to get them to take flyers and to talk about animal rights, etc. They don't approach me. They do not. I see them stopping Caucasian people, both male and female, and they look at me and then they look away because I assume that they assume that I'm not interested. Okay? You know who stops me? Environmentalists do that too. But the people that stop me are religious evangelists and people trying to get others to register to vote. Because I assume they think that I'm either interested in the Holy Spirit or that I'm not registered to vote. You know, and these are dangerous assumptions. When I'm hiking, and this is another digression that I wanted to bring to your attention. I'm going up the hill, and Caucasian people are coming down the hill or down the mountain, and they say to me, "You're almost there." Like I haven't done this hike a dozen times before. I don't see them doing that to, white people that are coming up the trail behind me. Okay? That was another digression, but I did want to point that out. In the area of hiring, if you're always choosing a person with a certain type of experience over someone who has perhaps the talent, potential, and education to do the job, then your organization is guaranteed to stay white, and those at the top are guaranteed to stay male. And why is that? That is because people of color often have not been given the same opportunities or the same exposure as Caucasians, their white counterparts. But they might have deeper connections to a group or a community that you are trying to reach. So think about that. And having said that, I want to say this to you as an employment lawyer. Check with employment counsel before you make a decision like that, because what you don't want to do is get yourself a claim of discrimination against the Caucasian person that has more experience that wasn't selected for the position. Okay? As I mentioned in a previous slide, all human animals fall within one of these protected groups. Challenge your assumptions about who will make a good employee. Someone who fits better within your current team may actually feel like they fit better to you because they went to the same types of schools that you went to. They have some of the same backgrounds as you did, and they have similar points of view. And if you continue to choose only individuals like this, then you're guaranteed to stay white in your organization. In areas of retention, and this is really important too, watch your behavior that results from implicit biases and avoid the microaggressions that I mentioned before. If you don't know how or you don't fully understand, then push your organization to get some real training on these issues. And if your organization or your company will not do that, or they can't afford to do that, then take it upon yourselves to educate yourselves. Go online, look for some training online, go to your library. This is all part of seeking understanding. In the area of promotions, think real hard about who you're considering and giving greater credence to. This is something that Joyce mentioned. Are you perceiving that your males are more confident and assertive, and are you choosing that necessarily over competence and effectiveness in a leadership position? Challenge your assumptions about who makes a good employee and who makes a good leader. What else can you do? Well, form support groups for women and people of color at work and across the industry. There's strength and power in numbers, as you all know, and you take these actions in order to make your voices heard. If your organization or firm has a strategic plan, make sure that issues of diversity and retention and inclusion is included as an overarching part of that plan and not just as a separate part of that program, so that you're thinking about diversity, retention, inclusion in every aspect of how you do business. Intentionally engage in the practice of stepping back and reflecting on inclusive decision-making in your employment actions so that it will ultimately lead to more equitable outcomes. And this is what I'm talking about when I say, or when you hear people say, look at your hiring, your employment decisions through an equity lens. Watch your words and your messaging. This is really important, and Joyce touched on it too, but I'm going to reiterate it here for you. There are offensive and inappropriate analogies within the animal rights movement comparing rodeo to rape of women, treatment of animals to black slavery in this country, euthanizing animals to the slaughter of Jews. And I put it to you that that kind of analogy is not effective on the minds of the people whose minds you seek to change. And for a couple of reasons, I think. First of all, if they don't understand why mistreatment of animals is a problem, using these groups as an analogy is not going to help. Okay, they probably don't have much sensitivity to these other groups anyway, right? Also, it really does alienate the marginalized group to hear that the suffering of their ancestors, their sisters, their mothers, other family members is being compared in any way to non-human animals or even to the suffering of another oppressed group. It does not help. So I put it to you that the mistreatment of animals is wrong in and of itself, and the analogies that I mentioned are wholly unnecessary. It's a sure way to ostracize people of color if you're trying to get them involved in the movement. And to Joyce's point, this is particularly true when people of color are quite cognizant of the fact that there is a general outrage by many members of the white majority in this country when an animal is mistreated, and the level of outrage, not to mention the lack of empathy when a person of color or communities of color are mistreated, until recently has gone markedly unchallenged. Okay? Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Well, this is a quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King from his April 16, 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. And my point in quoting it here is that racism and sexism is not the problem of women and people of color. All of humanity is inextricably tied together in the struggle to ensure equity of everyone. So I do encourage people, whether you're the victim, the unintentional perpetrator, or the bystander, to take action and speak out. And I don't say this lightly or without recognizing the potential consequences of speaking out. And I want to touch on those for you. I think that isolation and ostracism is one of the potential consequences. Because while it's true that you can help yourselves or others by speaking out, you may also, or alternatively, suffer harm. That's the reality, and I speak from experience. I'm not a wilting wallflower, I'm far from it, so I don't think it will surprise most of you to know that I speak out when I see issues that I think many of us perceive as inappropriate or offensive. And I think in some ways it's harmed me. It's harmed me in some personal friendships and professional relationships. And I think if you speak out in some ways, it may harm you as well. No matter how receptive the individual or organization might seem to you calling to their attention these issues. In fact, there's a quote that's attributed to Tacitus, and it says, "It is human nature to hate the man whom you have hurt." And I think that there's some truth in that. I think that after we realize that we've hurt someone, especially if we consider ourselves really good people, the good guys, then we have a hard time looking within and accepting that we maybe aren't the good guys. And so what you may experience from one of the good guys that you call to his or her attention, they've engaged in certain inappropriate behavior, what you may get from them is avoidance or resentment. But still, I think you should speak out, even though you may suffer for it, and here's why. I think that speaking out can lead to gradual change and progress. Some of the people that you confront regarding their concerning behavior or their harassing behavior and actions or biases, they may never do right by you, ever. Because as I said earlier, they may have some resentment for you. They might even appreciate what you did, but they may not do right by you. but here's what might happen and what I think does happen. It brings to their attention their behavior. So maybe they won't engage in that behavior in the next situation or towards the next person. So someone, either another woman or a person of color, may benefit for you having spoken out and for you having suffered for your actions. And I think in this way, it's how we start to shift the paradigm. And then there's what I call the good fight fatigue. It's wearying to always have to be the one or one of the few to speak out. And I think it's human nature. We just get tired, and sometimes we just let things pass. And I think, that's okay. It happens. But ultimately, though, I think that taking appropriate action and speaking out, making the case, results in a sense of dignity and pride for having had the courage and a tenacity to try to bring about these sorts of changes that we're talking about are badly needed within society as a whole and within the animal rights movement. So I'm going to wrap up here because I've been out of time. Raj has let me know for about a minute already. But just to close, beyond the law and beyond what you're legally required to do, it is so worth it to reflect on these issues and ask yourself and others the tough questions and take affirmative steps to ensure that the past looks different for women and people of color within the animal rights movement and employment than the future looks. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions. Yes.
So my question, either of you can answer this, is about sort of the issue of having really inappropriate analogies between animal rights and other movements, but then also, I know in school, the intersection between animal rights movements and environmental issues and humanitarian issues is a really important way for us to reach out to a lot of students. And I was at a different conference where they talked about the intersection between police violence in both animal welfare and the Black Lives Matter movement and just racism in general. And I'm wondering, when I was hearing these analogies, that sort of struck me as another possibly inappropriate analogy to be making. And I wonder if you feel like some co-sponsored events or coming together to talk about that issue from two different perspectives, is that the same kind of poor analogy, or is that an appropriate example of addressing a common issue that affects two distinct movements?
Let me take a shot at that, Joyce. So I think your question is, you've heard at other conferences that there's a comparison between police brutality towards the communities of color and the animal rights movement?
No, just that it's a common problem that impacts both, not necessarily in a minority community, but just they're two distinct groups that are impacted by police violence in two different ways, I guess. So, there's a lot of examples of and at this talk, they actually talked about the correlation between police districts or police groups that had really high rates of officer shootings of civilians and also officer shootings of animals. And that seems like one of those poor analogies now that I think about it.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that that's, I would consider that one a poor analogy. I think that there is a recognition, and Nicholas Kristof with the New York Times has often written about countries that have high rates of human rights violations, also have high rates of mistreatment of animals. So I think there's a correlation, but what the challenge is when we have people that are saying, I want to speak to you. I want to get you involved in my movement. I want to get some empathy from you. So what I'm going to do is compare, this mistreatment of whatever your particular racial, ethnic group or gender affiliation is to mistreatment of animals. And I think that the difference here is that people that fall within these groups, like a racial group or a gender group, don't appreciate the analogy versus having an understanding that there is a correlation of people that, or individuals that mistreat humans also mistreat animals. Okay, so I think that is a given, that we've got people that are just insensitive. And this takes it back to my initial comment to this audience, that if you're trying to use this analogy for people, on people that don't have a sensitivity to human rights violations, it's not going to work because they don't have that sensitivity to begin with. And using those analogies only serves to alienate the people who are the focus of those analogies.
So if we are working on trying to co-sponsor events or something at school, we need to be really sensitive about how we portray this partnership. Is that
Absolutely. And that goes back to being very careful about your words and your messaging.
I'm just curious if you could speak to what perceived traits might prevent members of minority groups from advancing, in particular in the animal law world, and how that might be addressed.
Perceived what?
Traits.
What do you mean by traits?
Right, so when you are considering someone for promotion or even for like a role as the head of your organization, what, qualities and attributes are you looking at that might end up leading to the choice of a white man instead of a woman of color? Talking about that and how that might be addressed in the realm of animal law.
Well, I think that what you're asking about is really speaking to issues of cultural competency. And we have to be careful when we're talking about issues of cultural competency that we also don't get into a situation where we're making gross generalizations about a group of people. But I will give you an example at the risk of stereotyping. Culturally, we know that often certain groups, maybe in Asian groups, are not as loud or boisterous or do not are very careful in the way that they communicate. And so there may be an assumption made that because this person is quiet in their communication, that they're not confident or that they are not competent in being able to communicate or be effective as a leader. And so what I would say is think very carefully about our assumptions about whatever trait we notice in an individual and make sure that we're not inadvertently ruling them out because culturally they don't take on the characteristics that we would normally think are great in a leader, like someone who comes off as super confident. And the fact is that a lot of people that come off as really confident aren't necessarily the most competent ones. So just challenge your assumptions.
Yeah.
Sorry. I have a question about the employment of women in animal law in general. So this is more for you, Joyce. So there are more women in law school than men. There tend to be a lot of women involved in the animal law community and in litigation shops, but it's always men who are generally leaders of these litigation shops. Do you have any plans at ALDF? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but are there kind of policies in place that are going to help retain and promote women within that community?
Good question. I don't know that we... Dillard, you're out. And I don't know that we have addressed that directly, whether we will be intentionally promoting or trying to attract women. It seems as if, as I'm trying to think about who we've had on staff, who female versus male, or not versus, but and my sense about how employment decisions have been based, it appears to me that it's been done based on competence. There's also the issue of cultural fit.
Each agency has its culture. The culture at ALDF is not the culture at HSUS, and it's not the culture at PETA. So who's going to fit into our culture? Those are questions we ask more than do we need male or female, although we do. You're practically under the desk. We do sometimes have those discussions, and I'm thinking now, of a discussion we've had where we asked ourselves, "Ooh, are there too many men on our staff? Are we hiring more male lawyers than female lawyers at this point, and do we need to balance that out?" So we do from that, but I don't think we've done a long-range strategic plan which addresses that.
Do you mind if I just follow up? I
Yeah.
really appreciate your response. I think that a lot of the problems with women in law in general is not that they're kind of it's not really a case-by-case issue. It's that the women take on more societal child rearing responsibilities generally. And I know that at law firms and in government, there are initiatives to help women advance through their organization and also take on these other responsibilities outside of the office that stereotypically men have not taken on in the same way that women have. And I just wanted to put it out there that as a law student who would like to work in animal law at some point, knowing that there's a structure there that would help me have a life outside of work and within a community that I care so much about would be really valuable.
Right, and that goes to the issue of culture. Does the organization, part of our core values is work-life balance, that we don't expect anyone to hang on a cross, we don't expect people to work, the 80, 120-hour week. That's, we're very conscious about that. We expect people to have free time, to have families, to have community things that they do, not just focus on animal law all of the time. So, and as we know, still to this day, women do shoulder most of the familial. It varies from couple to couple, but it's still women who are shouldering more than men of raising of children and of being the homemaker, if you will, in addition to, working their other full-time job. So that's something that we're conscious of. We do, there has, again, I look at ALDF from the long term, and they keep digging me up for the history of things. It's ageist.
Experience.
Yeah, thank you. I noticed that height was not on that list. But we've got Pam Hart here, who is the director of our animal law program. We've Pam Frosch was the director of our criminal justice program. Laura Dunn is the interim director of our criminal justice program, and then Carter, of course, is the director of litigation. We're conscious of it. I'm not sure how conscious of it. Sarah, do you want to? Am I putting you on the hot spot? Is that something that you're?
First, forgive me for doing this, Joyce, but I would like to add a little correction here. There are plenty of couples who are two women raising children, and so the preponderance may fall on one woman or the other.
Thank you.
I will say that.
Or one man or the other.
Indeed, indeed. Secondly, I would say my 28 years of experience in the animal protection movement have taught me that there is not a whole lot of endemic support for life outside of work. And that this is a burgeoning area that is being addressed because of students like you demanding it in a way that was unusual for those of us who started in the 80s in the animal protection movement, where it was you were all in, period. So I do see that changing, but it was interesting to me just thinking about this topic overall, and I'm so glad that you did this today. I live in DC. I live in a somewhat marginal neighborhood. I say that because I live there, not because of the other people who live there. My next door neighbor, who's an African American woman, shot me today something that she is just expanding over Facebook, which is really interesting, that when this particular presidential candidate came out with horrid words about Latinas and African Americans, that the Republican establishment stood by. But when it turned to white women who they could relate to, this has created the news cycle firestorm. And that to me is so illustrative of what you've been trying to share with us today, and I think is something that we all should be taking away from this conference too. It's not politics, it's this divided America that we live in.
I know we're way past time, but if I can just speak to what the young woman asked about. Remember I said things that you can do within your firm, within your company organization is form these support groups and talk about the issues and the challenges that you have. And you, by taking those kinds of actions, you can then approach whatever company or organization that you go to work with and say, I think it's a good idea if we come up with a plan for part-time, but for women still will be on the partnership track or the executive levels track, but here's an idea for part-time. And you can go on the internet and find plenty of companies and organizations that have something like this in place already and just crib from that, okay? And the more people that you have interested in this and that you talk about it to, the more support you have within the organization to take it to management and say, here, we think this is a good idea. And I think you'd be surprised at how receptive the powers that be would be to implementing some sort of program, because it helps for purposes of recruitment and retention and inclusion that I spoke about.
Just because we're out of time, I wanted to remind everyone, if you're taking CLE credits, to be sure to sign in and out outside the door here, and join me in thanking our two speakers.